Greetings, I'm Shad, and I want to do an in-depth analysis on what makes bad weapons bad and good weapons good, separate to memes and jokes and the way that I like to ham it up at times. No, this is actually going to be a proper analytical breakdown, where I'll explain that there is actually an objective standard, irrespective of my views on the matter or anyone else's views on the matter, that exists as an irrefutable standard that actually gauges weapons effectiveness. The reason for me wanting to make this video is that I feel that people have started to misunderstand the objective standard that should be applying. Instead, what seems to be more common is that if a weapon can merely function as a weapon and has a certain level of effectiveness in only a few categories, it is therefore a good weapon merely because it's able to function as one. Not only do I think this is an incorrect standard to judge weapons, but I also feel it's an incorrect standard that we don't apply to many other things when we try and judge their effectiveness. For instance, when we try and determine if a car is a good car. For a weapon or a car to achieve its purpose, it must satisfy multiple criteria to at least a moderate or acceptable level. And if it disregards certain criteria entirely, even if it excels in other areas, we would never regard it as a good car, and we shouldn't regard it as a good weapon. We wouldn't call a car that's perfect in every regard but wasn't made with brakes a good car. That fundamental flaw is so detrimental to its function that it can't function effectively in its purpose at all. So in looking at weapons, this is the standard that I did not come up with. It exists irrespective of me, and it's the one that, of course, I use when I analyze any weapons, and I put aside my bias. It doesn't matter how much I love it. If it fails in this objective standard, it's a bad weapon regardless of my feelings on the matter. I think my adherence to this is proven by the fact that I've actually criticized many beloved weapons, some that I have loved myself, and even received mountains of criticism and hate as a result. People can like certain weapons quite passionately, but in terms of the really aggressive criticism and stuff that's disingenuous, I just laugh it off and don't let it bother me. In contrast to this, I know from praising iconic weapons that are beloved by large communities garners tremendous goodwill. This has happened to me in real life. I've seen it from my videos when I analyze and end up praising as a result of me using an objective standard, not my own bias, but I end up praising it because there are actual genuinely good elements to it. Say when I looked at the Crucible sword from Doom or the chain sword from Warhammer. Those communities loved those videos, they shared them a lot, and I became somewhat popular as a result. Now, this reality has tempted me at times to go easier on other weapons from beloved properties, to be a bit charitable by focusing on whatever redeeming features I can logically justify when not drawing attention to the other blatant flaws that this weapon has in its design. But even though I've been tempted to do this, I never have. I believe in objective truth regardless of my or other people's opinions or feelings on the matter, and I would encourage all people to do the same thing, but the thing is, it does legitimately cause backlash when you end up criticizing things that people love. It's just the nature and result of reality, even though in truth I hold no ill feelings to anyone who loves the things I criticize. I can dislike a thing but still feel perfectly fine about appreciating and getting along with people who disagree with me. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are still tremendously immature on the matter, and they get very offended by it and they can't take any playful teasing or banter on the matter. And really, they just need to grow up. Sometimes you just need to laugh at yourself, even make fun of yourself, because the world is pretty dark and sometimes you need to laugh at the darkness. And I make fun of myself in jest as much as I make fun of anything or even any individuals in jest as well. You might have noticed this on a certain video that was made by an individual who I am forced to work with, Professor Chadlooks. Sometimes you just need to laugh at stuff, and that includes yourself. And if people can't handle that because they get offended at the slightest thing, well then they deserve to be so upset and offended for being so immature and overly sensitive. But that's the path that I choose to walk down regardless of the backlash I receive, because once again, I believe in objective truth regardless of people's feelings on the matter. And that includes the objective truth on if a weapon is good or bad. So then, what is the standard I use in analyzing the effectiveness of weapons that exists irrespective of my own bias or personal preferences on the matter? Well, it's very easy to explain, but I will then go into greater detail to validate it and establish it as it being objective. This isn't my own opinion on the matter. It is simply this. Is the weapon in question as effective as other weapons of the same size and weight? And when knowing enough about effective weapons, would you choose this weapon when you have the option to choose other weapons? Is there any situation that you would choose this weapon over others when considering its effectiveness in combat? If not, the weapon in question is probably not that good, but at the very least, not as good as the weapon you chose. If it's literally not good enough for anyone to want to use when other weapons are available, it is obviously a crap weapon. Now, don't take this analogy out of context. This does not mean everyone would only choose, say, the spear whenever you're thinking of what weapons you should choose. There are many situations which encourage different weapons, and as I asked, is there any situation that you would choose this weapon over other weapons when considering its effectiveness in combat? There are many situations that would encourage picking a vast array of weapons, but if the specific weapon in question is rarely ever picked or just never picked at all, it's clearly a bad weapon. I understand that this simple analogy isn't perfect because there are a lot of bad weapons that could still be picked if the person simply doesn't know enough about what makes a weapon good or not. They can simply be misinformed. It's for this reason that I need to go into greater detail. I have criticized a lot of bad weapons throughout the history of my YouTube channel. But two weapons in particular have received more kind of backlash or disagreement, mostly from people loving the weapon and not for actual objective reasons that they propose. And if they do propose reasons for why these weapons are actually good, they disregard so many of its flaws, more focusing on whatever redeeming features they can find. And by disregarding the flaws, they then say, see, this is actually a good weapon. But when taken in the proper context, analyzing all the aspects of what a weapon should be doing to make it a good weapon, no, these weapons aren't good. I received emails, there are forum threads, reply videos are made. The two in particular I'm talking about are, of course, the nunchucks and the Klingon bat'leth. And I'm serious about that. I've actually received email equivalent discourses on why the bat'leth is actually a good weapon from people, fans that watched my video so many years ago. And those are the ones that I'm more replying to when I'm making this video, that I feel we need to understand the proper context of why bad weapons are bad and good weapons are good, and that there is an objective standard that exists irrespective of our own biases or ways that we might try and be more charitable when in reality we really shouldn't. So when going into more detail about this objective standard, I will be referring to nunchucks and the Klingon bat'leth as the primary points of references, even though I could pick any weapon, and we probably will be picking some actual properly effective weapons, framing it completely in this standard. So, to begin, what is a weapon's purpose? It is actually quite clear, you can't really argue this point. It is to increase the damage potential or lethality of whoever is using it. If a weapon does not do this, it is not a weapon, and in extension to this objective reality, if the weapon fulfills this purpose well, and even better, if it fulfills it exceptionally well, it is therefore a good weapon. So just because an object can function as a weapon does not make it an effective, efficient, or simply just a good weapon. Anyone is free to think it is cool, but stating that it is good is an objective statement and therefore must be qualified. And I will challenge anyone who tries to say a bad weapon is good by simply referring to this objective standard. A weapon is not good if it can just be qualified as a weapon. Well, it can do a lot of damage. No, that's not good enough for it to be classed as good. For instance, a rock can function as a weapon, but does that make it a good weapon? This is largely determined by context. For instance, how do we determine what is good? The very concept of quality at first is arbitrary because it fundamentally needs a point of reference to compare it against. But once that point of reference exists, it is no longer arbitrary, but it is objective. It's fixed. For instance, what is big? Mount Everest might be considered big in comparison to a person, but it is minuscule when compared to the size of a planet. If we look back at the rock analogy, the first point of reference is the damage a person can produce by themselves. A rock can greatly increase this, so in comparison to nothing or bare hands, well, a rock is a great weapon. And this seems to be what people try and do when they establish poorer weapons as good by trying to shift the point of reference that they're comparing it against to more charitable and honestly more unfair comparisons. Many bad weapons can be considered objectively great if you're comparing them against bare hands or things as poor as rocks, for instance. Even a rock is great when compared to nothing, but the fact is, the point of reference that should be used when trying to determine if anything is good is objectively anything else that is meant to fulfill the same purpose. For instance, if you're trying to determine what is the fastest car in the world, you could never objectively find that out or say this car is the fastest car in the world if you are obviously disregarding a car that's faster than it. But many people try and say that certain weapons are good when there are hundreds of weapons that are vastly superior to it, but they say, no, don't consider those weapons, this weapon is good, when they're literally not considering all the other weapons that are better than it, because as soon as you bring in all the other weapons to have the point of reference to compare them against, it's actually a very bad weapon in comparison to the other weapons. I understand that there are contexts which could logically disclude certain weapons. For instance, are you looking at battlefield weapons? Are you looking at weapons that excel for self-defense? What about non-lethal weapons? These are all obvious subcategories, but even in the subcategories, people often disregard vastly superior weapons within these subcategories when they're trying to justify the effectiveness of a clearly inferior weapon that they just have a personal bias or appreciation for. Therefore, the discussion whether a weapon is good cannot be limited to simply if a person is more lethal than if they had nothing, because weapons have a purpose, and any weapon that achieves that purpose in a more efficient way is objectively a better weapon than the other. The weapons that achieve their purpose in the most efficient way are the best weapons, and the weapons that achieve their purpose in the least effective way are the worst weapons. You cannot escape this fact. It is a truth of reality, regardless of anyone's subjective interpretations or feelings on the matter. When more than one weapon exists, their effectiveness stand in contrast to one another, and in this you then have a hierarchy of effectiveness, of utility, of the good and the bad. And the reality is, there are vastly more weapons that are made and designed to be weapons than just two. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them. There are several objective metrics that must be considered when trying to determine what makes a weapon better in achieving its purpose. Disregarding or ignoring any one of these objective and essential metrics is not only short-sighted, but ultimately invalidates anyone's analysis on the matter, because each one of these points are an essential component of how a weapon operates. They are ease of use. How much training do you need to use it to increase your damage potential? A weapon that is more easily used when picking it up simply functions as a more effective weapon than one that takes vastly more training. More people will get use and utility out of the weapon as a result. And if a weapon simply can't be used except with years upon years of training, unless with those years upon years of training it blows all the weapons out of the water in all the other categories, its effectiveness is brought down vastly as a result. Any weapon that you can pick up and use effectively with very little training and it performs very well in the other categories that I'll mention is already a superior weapon than one that takes more training. The next point, energy input to damage output. Weapons are supposed to be force multipliers, and so if it can produce high levels of damage with very little effort, it is then a very good weapon in this regard, but you can't disregard the other aspects. All these objective metrics must be considered together. And just saying that this weapon can do this one thing really, really well doesn't validate it if it performs very poorly in the other metrics. But of course, any weapon that can produce high damage for very little effort is already going to be put higher on the scale. The best example of this would be a gun. You pull, a finger, okay? The finger is what causes the gun to operate, an action that requires so little effort, yet the damage level as a result is incredible. The next is the actual damage and the energy transferring into the target. For instance, you could have a pole arm, and thanks to leverage and momentum, it should be able to produce a lot of force, even for a little amount of effort or energy that you put into it. But if the actual striking end is, say, a sponge, which just nullifies and disperses the force that no true damage is transferred into the target, well then it's obviously not an effective weapon. Now of course you'll rarely ever put a sponge on the end of a weapon, but still damage can be done by things that have padding. Just look at injuries that can result out of LARP weapons. But those aren't made to be damage-dealing weapons. When we look at damage-dealing weapons, there are different configurations that optimize the transferal of energy or damage, and this is usually related to surface area. Context also plays a role in this. Spreading out damage over a larger surface area can make a weapon more effective against, say, armor, but less lethal against someone who is unarmored if you compare, say, a warhammer to a sword. The warhammer is actually lower on the second metric that I explained, energy input to damage output. You need to actually inject a higher amount of energy to achieve lethal damage with a warhammer than you do with a sword. If you can place the blade along someone's neck, you do not need a lot of force to do lethal damage to cut someone's artery open. And so a sword is also effective in the third metric in its ability to transfer the damage into the target. But a sword is more ineffective in this third metric if you're looking at someone who's wearing armor. A sword is actually very inefficient in transferring damage into the target thanks to armor, and that's where the way that the damage is transferred is very important, and a warhammer is more effective. So that is the third metric. The fourth metric, and I've kind of combined some similar and related aspects into this, is its ability to strike the target at a distance, strike a target with speed, and strike a target from multiple angles. So this is all related in its ability to make contact with the target, but there are different ways in which that is achieved. Three specifically, as I mentioned, which are basically reach, speed, and versatility. Each one is an important aspect of a weapon's function, and any weapon that achieves high effectiveness in this fourth metric will be higher on the quality or comparison on effective weapons. Safety to the user and its defense capacity. This is safety in use, but also its ability to defend the user from other attacks coming in, targeting the person using it. They're kind of two separate functions, but they are also inherently related to basically the safety of the user or the ability the user has to keep themselves safe when using it. And the last metric is durability. If the weapon breaks after a few uses, it is obviously a less effective weapon than a weapon that is vastly more durable. And if a weapon has a fatal weak point, again, that makes it a more ineffective weapon if you consider all the other metrics as well. But those are the primary objective metrics that determine a weapon's effectiveness. I will quickly summarize them: ease of use, energy input to damage output, damage and energy transferring into the target, its ability to strike the target at distance with speed and at multiple different angles, safety to the user and its defense capacity, and lastly, durability. Other metrics can be argued, such as concealability, ease of carry, and so on, and even though these are important to be considered in other contexts, they stand outside of the weapon's proper utility in combat. Also, some might think that there are important metrics overlooked, but before you suggest one, I encourage you to look at these metrics as I've explained them. For instance, if you think reach has not been considered, well, that's obviously under the metric of the weapon's ability to strike the target, but it encompasses broader standards that we should be considering, more than just reach. All these factors are extremely important metrics to gauge a weapon's effectiveness. A good weapon needs at least a small function in each of these categories, and if any weapon has no function in any one of these categories, but even if its effectiveness in other categories, it will not be able to function as a weapon. Seriously, take away any one of these. Even if the weapon can still function in the other metrics, if you take away one completely, it simply won't be able to function as a weapon. This is why these are the objective metrics that exist when comparing or analyzing the effectiveness of a weapon, as I've explained, because if you take away one of them, the weapon is useless. Take away ease of use completely, well, if you can't even use the weapon, it doesn't matter how much damage it can be done, it's a useless weapon. Take away energy input to damage output. If it takes so much energy to achieve any level of damage that you barely can even lift the thing, it is mostly a useless weapon. Damage and energy transferring in the target. If you can't transfer the damage effectively or properly into the target to the point that it does no damage, it's a useless weapon. Its ability to strike the target at distance, or strike it with speed, or strike it from multiple angles. If you can't even strike effectively with it, make contact with the target. Doesn't matter how much damage it does. Doesn't matter how easy it is to use. Doesn't matter how effectively it would be in transferring it. If you can't simply make contact, useless weapon. Safety to the user and its ability to defend yourself. This is why these ones are related, because you need to take both away for the weapon to be useless. You can have weapons that are incapable of defending the user properly, like a gun. A gun can very rarely be used to defend against, say, another gun, or effectively against many other weapons. Mildly effectively, but not greatly effectively. But it's also safety to the user. If it is inherently dangerous to the user and it has no defense capacity, doesn't matter how much damage it can do, if there's a high chance of it killing you at the same time, it's a useless weapon. You would never use it. And lastly, durability. If it's going to break after a few hits or even the first hit, well, it might be useful for only that one hit, but then it's a useless weapon after that completely as well. These are the objective metrics. They exist irrespective of your opinion. You can argue until the cows come home. If you ignore any one of these metrics, especially if it's an aspect of the weapon in question fails at in a large measure, doesn't need to fail completely, but if it fails even mostly, that's going to affect the weapon's overall effectiveness and quality in a large measure. Even if you try and ignore it, it still objectively exists. And we can look at this now to justify this standard by comparing it against nunchucks and the Klingon bat'leth. Nunchucks are not easy to use, they take a lot of practice. The energy input to damage output is debatable. You can actually produce high force with little effort with nunchucks, but when you compare it to, say, other weapons of the same size and for the same purpose, nunchucks are actually on the lower end of the scale because there are so many weapons that require very little effort that can produce insane levels of lethality. Nunchucks are not effective lethal weapons. They are lethal weapons. I'll never say they can't produce lethal force, but the amount of energy you need to put into them to achieve lethal force is actually quite high. Compare this to a dagger or many other weapons that require very little energy to achieve lethal force. Nunchucks are actually quite low on the metric. Damage and energy transferring into the target. If you have any measure of padding at all, nunchucks' effectiveness gets reduced drastically. This is the problem with them being blunted weapons. And they don't have huge amounts of impact follow-up force to really drive concussive damage through anything like armor. Its ability to strike a target at distance, strike with speed, they are pretty fast. Strike from multiple angles. The nunchucks' directions or angles of attack are hampered drastically by the way that they are meant to be used and to try and reduce damage to the user. To enable follow-up through on the strikes, they are nowhere near as versatile as many other weapons. People might say they're very versatile when compared by themselves, but they are not as versatile in comparison to many other weapons that can strike at a target from any angle and any direction. There is objectively certain angles, directions of attack, stances, and positions in which you cannot strike effectively with nunchucks. Safety to the user and its defense capacity. This is a big failing in the nunchucks. No matter how well trained you are, there is always a possibility of them striking the user. You can try and be trained to lessen the likelihood of that happening, but the very fact that the possibility still exists with them and exists vastly more than other weapons makes nunchucks inherently dangerous weapons to the user, and their defense capacity is very poor. And also their durability is also lessened. That's why they try and make metal chains, but they are made out of more components, and when you have any object, this is just an engineering reality. More components means more points of possible failure, especially if the nunchucks are made out of less durable materials like rope. But because nunchucks can function as a weapon and perform adequately in some of these metrics, many people try and ignore, excuse, or gloss over its tremendous failings and weaknesses, trying to then say just because it can do some of these things, it's a great weapon. No, it is not. A good weapon, remember, we're talking about a good weapon, not just a barely tolerable or even adequate weapon. We're looking for what makes them good and what makes them bad. And a good weapon is one that at least performs adequately in each one of these metrics
metrics. Can you honestly say the nunchuck performs adequately in each one of these metrics? And that there are not other weapons meant to achieve the same purpose in the same general size and weight that does not perform better. This is why the nunchuck is objectively a bad weapon.
If we were to compare this analysis to many other weapons, and the big point of comparison that I've always used against the nunchucks is the humble stick. And here's the reality, people. Separate to memes and everything, the stick is actually on the lower end of the hierarchy of weapons in effectiveness, durability, damage potential, and everything like that. The stick is actually not a good weapon, and yes, putting the memes aside and being honest and truthful, no, the stick is not a great weapon. It's actually a very poor weapon, because when you had the option to pick any other weapon, remember the more simplified version of this objective standard? Is the weapon as effective as other weapons of the same size and weight? When knowing enough about effective weapons, would you choose this weapon when you have other options to choose from? Is there any situation that you would choose this weapon over other weapons when considering its effectiveness in combat? The thing is, the humble stick in certain contexts has, in rare instances, been picked over other weapons in actual combat. There are unique advantages that make the stick not nearly as inefficient as other weapons, but still on the broader metric as a whole, the stick is definitely on the lower end of the scale when you compare all weapons against one another when you look at these objective metrics. Compare a stick to a sword in ease of use, energy input to damage output, damage energy transferring into the target, its ability to strike at the target at distance, strike at the target with speed and from multiple angles, safety to the user and defense capacity, and durability. A sword comes out on top in nearly every single category. It is a vastly superior weapon. It's just interesting that the stick isn't horrible in one or two of these metrics, whereas the nunchucks most definitely are horrible in multiple metrics. The stick is a vastly superior weapon to nunchucks, and I use that because the stick is actually a poor weapon, and if the nunchucks are so bad that they can't even compare against the stick, that makes them rubbish. And then for comedic overemphasis, I've memed the effectiveness of a stick just to drive that painful reality home to people who unreasonably think the nunchucks are great. Oh yeah? Compare it to a stick. Just for your own reference, what is that unique kind of situational context in which the stick isn't a wholly ineffective weapon that someone might actually choose to use? Well, it's in warfare against armored opponents. The stick club has been used by people historically, even over choosing a sword, because remember these other contexts that can also affect a weapon's effectiveness, like a sword against armor. A sword is an especially ineffective weapon against plated armor, and the stick, because of its ability to transfer energy damage into the target, being more effective in that important metric against armor, a club stick is actually a more effective weapon in that instance than even a sword. So it's not a wholly ineffective weapon, depending on the type of stick, because there are lots of different types of sticks, obviously. So when I call the stick a bad weapon, it is not a wholly bad weapon. It's not as bad as many other weapons, and there are certain unique contexts in which it can perform better than other certain weapons. But on the overall scale, on balance, the stick is most definitely on the poorer end of the spectrum, which is why they're not universally picked as the ultimate weapon, because if a person really did have a choice and they needed to fight against armor, they wouldn't pick a stick, they'd pick a mace or a warhammer if they had the option. The stick has a very special and interesting advantage in a metric that aren't considered in the primary metrics of a weapon's effectiveness and function in combat. This is a metric outside of its effectiveness in combat, but can be considered in certain instances, which might give it preference, and that's how easy they are to make or find. You can find a stick anywhere, or it can be a lot harder to find a mace or hammer or sword. But disregarding that fact, no one would ever pick a stick if they had the option of a warhammer or mace, because they're specifically designed to do what the stick is mostly meant to do, but designed to do it better. And that's the point. And even I will obviously acknowledge this with all the memes and the inflating I've done of the sticks for comedic purposes and everything like that. No, who in their right mind would ever pick a stick when they had the option to pick other sticks and the materials, the ability to get access to any other weapon of the same size, and meant to achieve the same purpose. I don't think anyone would logically do that when you take away bias and all that stuff and you just put it against the obvious objective metric that exists, irrespective of my opinion and other people's opinions. When more than one thing exists that are meant to achieve the same purpose, the effectiveness in which they achieve that purpose objectively creates a hierarchy of effectiveness of quality that you cannot argue against. There are better weapons than other weapons. And anyone who is even mildly aware of this objective metric, and most people are aware of it subconsciously because we use the metric in analyzing and comparing things in life all the time. Your favorite foods are the foods that satisfy, slate your hunger, but also you enjoy more than others. You have a hierarchy of food preference based on it achieving the purpose of giving you nourishment, health, taste. We compare things against other things everywhere in reality and life. We use the same standard everywhere, and so disregarding this standard or just pretending that we don't have to consider all aspects of the standard when trying to determine if a weapon is good or not is a false standard. It is incorrect. You are then creating a subjective opinion that can be objectively false and proven as false when you appeal to the objective standard that exists. It cannot be logically or fairly objectively denied. You can deny it subjectively, but that just means you're wrong. This standard can and will be validated once more when we look at the other weapon that has been of more contention than many weapons I've analyzed and criticized, the Klingon bat'leth. Is it easy to use? Not more so than many other weapons. In actual fact, it is a vastly more awkward weapon in design than many other weapons. Its weight distribution is awful, even when you try and use it in the easiest way, like an axe or a sword, which kind of already implies which weapons are better, an axe or sword, than a bat'leth. If just the easiest way to use a bat'leth is like other weapons that are better designed and their weight distribution is specifically designed to enhance its function in this handhold, kind of tells you which one is better already. But even the easiest ways to use a bat'leth like a sword or axe is still vastly more awkward. You can pick it up, anyone can pick it up and do it, so it's not necessarily that you need training to be able to do it, but more training will help you mitigate the poor balance, its awkwardness of use and stuff like that. But in any comparison to many other weapons of the same size and meant for the same function and purpose, it is very poor in its ease of use. It is a particularly awkward and cumbersome weapon, and I'm referencing tests that people have done and used, and even just looking at the thing I can tell. Energy input to damage output is an interesting one. It can achieve a certain amount of damage. It clearly has decent leverage when used like a sword or axe, which already shows how superior sword or axe is, once again. But even with the possible power of this strike, it has so much forward unsymmetrical weight that the edge alignment is vastly more difficult to maintain than other weapons, and its difficulty in edge alignment is still much more than, say, an axe, which also has a point of balance in front of the handhold. The bat'leth is vastly more unbalanced in weight, which pushes itself out of alignment more than an effective axe would ever do. It can generate very lethal force, but the energy required to do so is so much higher than other weapons, especially due to all the needless weight. It is shorter, and the handholds are not optimized for versatility. To reach one of the handholds, you have to release your grip and then re-grip it. You just can't slide it up a shaft. It is less versatile in reach, meaning its ability to generate force due to leverage and rotation is greatly hindered by its unoptimized design. Its forward spike gets in the way of its larger one, making it more likely that the forward spike will hit first, which is closer to their hands and will have less rotational inertia as a result, and hit with less force. If you put the weight of the first spike inside the second spike by removing the forward spike completely, you would maintain the momentum but improve the balance and effectiveness in striking and optimize the rotational inertia. That forward spike on each end is pointless. It's useless, just makes it a worse weapon overall. Pointless, unnecessary weight, as pointless as the many useless spikes that we see often in many fantasy designs that myself and many others have criticized all the time, and so I'm baffled why people will then disregard the same objective criticism that we applied to many other weapons when we're criticizing the bat'leth. It has pointless, needless spikes as well, which just increase the weight, the awkwardness, reduces the effectiveness of the damage transferring into the target because the forward spike hits before the second spike. Oh, it's just pointless. It's bad. It is a bad design element in a big way. Now, additional weight in either end of a weapon in most cases does not increase the striking power of the other, meaning when striking with a bat'leth like a sword or axe, all the unnecessary weight near your hands is doing nothing, barely increasing the power of the strike in comparison to if that weight was actually placed on the striking end, or if it was placed in some measure of effective counterbalance. Instead, this additional weight makes the weapon needlessly more cumbersome while providing barely any additional striking power, throws off the balance of the weapon, and makes it heavier and harder to generate speed. Now, in the metrics that I've already mentioned, this is just 2, so many other weapons excel beyond the bat'leth in huge ways. So already the bat'leth is a pathetically ineffective weapon in comparison to many other weapons of the same size that are meant to do the same thing. And we're just on 2 metrics, but already I've explained, if a weapon fails drastically in even one of these metrics, it is a vastly ineffective and inefficient weapon. For a weapon to overall be considered at least decent in its purpose, achieving its purpose effectively, it needs to have each one of these objective metrics achieved at least moderately well, okay? If it is actually considered bad in any one of these metrics, overall the weapon is going to be pretty bad. But there are unique situations, which I've already explained, which might mitigate this, but it's not happening with the bat'leth, is it? I've really kind of considered 3 metrics on the bat'leth already, because I've already kind of talked about the fact that the smallest spike hits first, and that will reduce the overall power and leverage of the primary longer spike, which should have higher rotational inertia, and that makes its damage and energy transfer into the target very poor. Seriously, already, if you were to look at the bat'leth and give it one clean, consistent blade and curve, and none of these additional secondary spikes would already make it a more effective weapon than its previous design, I wouldn't consider it good, but it would be better, vastly more so, in a big way, than its current design. Its current design is absolute crap. Yes, it can hit with a lot of damage, but a weapon should be able to do more than just do a lot of damage. Otherwise, everyone will be using rocks. And yes, some people use rocks when they don't have access to other weapons, but that's the point. When you have access to other better weapons, who in their right mind would ever honestly pick the bat'leth as their primary first pick when you had other superior weapons to choose from? If the bat'leth would never be picked in this context, how could you honestly say it's a good weapon? In terms of transferal of damage into the target, its curved design also limits its thrusting capacity to a large degree, especially since the spikes are placed so far off from the point of thrust, which is trying to transfer the energy into the thrust, and it gets wasted in the curve, and you're fighting against the weapon wanting to be pushed off at an angle than just pushing it cleanly forward in the thrust. The next metric, its ability to strike at the target at distance, strike a target with speed, and strike a target from multiple angles, while the handholds are placed in the middle of the weapon, not at one end, limiting the overall weapon reach for its size and weight. The unnecessary weight will make it much slower. Heavier weapons are easier to predict because they take longer to accelerate, and therefore the beginning of the strike is easier to notice and then block or avoid. It can strike at different angles easier, granted, due to being double-ended, but this is countered by the excessive weight used and its awkward design. For instance, when holding the bat'leth like a sword, it is more cumbersome to strike with the other end due to so much weight being situated above the handholds. And when holding the bat'leth by either end like a staff, striking with either end will be easier due to holding it at the center of balance, but then you have severely limited your reach because the blades extend very little past each handhold. Also, even when you use it like a sword or axe, there is a spike protruding quite far, but not far enough to be properly effective, from the handhold, pointing downwards, and this limits your range of motion in terms of crossing the blade across your body, getting to different angles and positions, and you always have to be mindful of that spike potentially hitting you. This also makes it more dangerous to the user, which is the next metric, but also use in defense. I think the bat'leth could be somewhat effective used in defense because it does protect the handholds. You could use it somewhat like a blocking type of shield, but its overall safety to the user, especially when you need to use it in more optimal ways like a sword or axe to optimize the damage, it is vastly more dangerous to the user. Also, because there are blades directly above the handholds, there are strikes that puts one's hands directly into the cutting line. The bat'leth design, by the placement of the hand positions and blades, literally encourages the user to place their hands near the striking end, and unlike daggers where there is something near the hand, the striking end, that prevents the hand from hitting the target and potentially being damaged, we're talking about hilts and crossguards to stop the weapon. The bat'leth has nothing like that. The blade can continue to travel into the target to the point where your hand actually hits the target, potentially damaging it. But the bat'leth would be durable. It's a metal weapon. It's a sci-fi weapon, and there is interesting context that you can try and bring in regards to the bat'leth's proper analysis, but not as much as you might think. Like saying the Klingons are aliens does not work at all because they're humanoid creatures with the same range of motions as regular humans. Are Klingons stronger than humans? Actually, whenever we see humans fighting Klingons in Star Trek, they're usually depicted just as strong as humans because there are often humans overpowering Klingons in melee combat. And so if the Klingons are stronger than humans, it's not so much so to give them an unbeatable advantage. And look, honestly, I actually decided to check this out online because people have emailed me trying to say this point. And no, there is no official canon thing saying Klingons are always stronger than humans. You might have a unique tough Klingon that might be stronger than most humans, but you can get a unique tough human that can be as strong as that Klingon and stronger than most other Klingons. And so that point is actually not true.
The Klingons are as diverse a people as any. Some of them are strong and some of them are weak.
And the alien point, no, because they're bipedal humanoid creatures with the same range of motion, therefore we can consider it in the exact same context if a human is using it and criticize it in the same way for how ineffectively designed and awkward it is for its range of motion and utility with its handholds and so on. The Klingon bat'leth is a crap weapon. It is objectively terrible. Just because it can do one or two things moderately okay, you know, it can do a lot of damage, it can't transfer that damage effectively, consistently, with ease of use, and so many, it falls short in so many other aspects that no, it is a horrible weapon.
In trying to fix the bat'leth's design problems, its flaws, this is the design that I've concluded. No unnecessary weight in the pointless additional spike, the ability to slide your hand up and down to the different handhold positions, moving the primary handhold position closer to one end, which optimizes your reach and leverage, which will increase your damage capacity with it. I've made the larger primary spike even bigger than the original design, which actually increased power, instead of separating it into two spikes where the first spike just takes away the main bite of the second spike, still keeping a bottom spike on the other end, which will allow you to strike from either end of the weapon, but with the spike on the bottom end being smaller, it is less dangerous to the user. Because I've removed those two small additional spikes that were situated further forward from the handhold positions, I've been able to place the main blade more in line with the actual handholds, which will give you more control over edge alignment and leverage. By removing the smaller secondary spikes and making the blade that covers the knuckles much thinner, the new design would also be much lighter overall, but because the main striking end actually has just as much mass but all focused into one primary cutting spike, it would actually hit with more power. It's a lighter weapon that is more powerful, therefore more optimized. And if I was making this, I'd even go further and have the handholds made out of wood, a lighter but sturdy material, which would make it even more easy to use but not take away the power of the primary striking ends. That also means you need to exert less energy to achieve lethal results. It is a simplified but vastly superior design to the original one. And as I really look at it, there are some unique benefits that you'll get out of this type of weapon. Does combine certain advantages of an axe and sword. The ability to move your hand up and down the handhold positions will give you a lot more leverage in recovering from strikes. It gives you more protective options than a sword because there is that blade that protects the hands, and now you can move the hand away from any strike that might have put the hand in the same position where the blade would strike the target, which then allows you to protect the hand vastly more. This one is actually a good effective weapon, whereas the original one is not. It is objectively garbage.
And trying to justify both the Klingon bat'leth and the nunchucks and just looking for whatever small thing it might be able to do moderately adequate, not truly well, but we could give it this, consideration and charity that it could at least do that, doesn't redeem all the other horrible failings in it. regardless of the people that we might be pleasing by trying to give a more charitable interpretation and incorrectly disregarding many other objective flaws these weapons have. And it is those very flaws that cannot be ignored, because disregarding them doesn't mean those flaws don't exist. They do, and it's those very flaws that make bad weapons bad. So please do remember that this is not my opinion. This is the standard that I am forced to conform to, because it is the objective standard that exists irrespective of my feelings or how much I like the weapon because I think it looks cool or I love the property it comes from or any number of reasons, okay? Remember, I've always said I think the nunchucks are actually fun and cool. I said that in the very first video. These are fun, cool, flashy weapons. But just because I have liked them and trained in them and used them for a long time in the past doesn't mean I will disregard the objective truth. And that is the reality of the matter. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. And of course, I hope to see you on the next video here on Shadiversity. So until that time, farewell.